Do you think submissions such as those by your organization and the other rights groups will go far enough to convince government not to go ahead with these proposed changes?
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to your listeners. I think that the South African government has done quite well in some instances, on migration-related issues, and we believe that we have got a very valid case and plea, to the government, and as a result, we believe that with the plethora of legislation that South Africa has, especially on children's rights, it would really be very difficult for them to ignore that, because you're looking at children that do not have, any particular choice in this matter, and born in South Africa not because they choose to be in South Africa. We know there is the case of the children that are currently not able to write, their matric exams because they don't have the documentation. So we're still hoping that, we can engage government to realize that, the stance that it is taking in these particular instances are basically, sentencing, children to a life of criminality, and that is unemployability.
You've raised the issue of how, if these changes were to come into effect, the children of undocumented migrants would not be able to sit for matric exams. But that raises the question of how would they have got as far as matric if they don't have the documentation which would now allow them to matriculate?
Well, I think what is happening right now is that we've got quite a number of these children that are attending schools, and the problem basically, comes in when they are supposed to write their matric, because this is when they have to bring their ID documentation. So prior to that, I'm not sure how basically they're enrolled, but we're trying to find out, how this situation can be, ameliorated. Now, you will appreciate that it's not only even, the issue of undocumented parents, especially in regards to this particular legislation that is being proposed. It is actually migrant children, whether they are refugees, because now the government is saying, all these migrants, because they don't have permanent residence, it means they cannot get birth certificates. And what this essentially means is that, children of refugees, who are people that may not go back to their countries because of political reasons, and because they are people that are on flight or running away or fleeing their government. So it means that even if they are given that notification to take to their consulate or wherever, they are not in a position to get any birth certificate. And assume that they did get the birth certificate, then what? Because they'll still need a passport after that. And, to apply for a passport, to their government, which in any case they are not able to go back to. And secondly, the 2014, I think, amendment basically says that if anybody is applying for a visa, to come into South Africa, they must apply from their country of birth. So we're basically saying, again, these children must go back to their countries, and these children are born here with both parents here that have fled their countries for economic and political reasons. And we are saying that these parents must then go back, with these children and stop working or whatever it is that they are doing that is sustaining them in South Africa. And that looks really impossible, and it looks like something that has not been properly thought through.
Am I right in supposing then that what is making it difficult for organizations like the African Diaspora Forum, Mr. Sibanda, to motivate against this, perhaps from a data perspective, is just the inaccurate numbers around how many people we have in the country as far as asylum seekers put together with those who've come into the country illegally, either fleeing economic collapse or violence back home?
Partly true, and I think contributes largely to the problem that we have, because I think the figures that we have in terms of how many migrants are in South Africa, either legally or illegally, is much higher than what is basically being shared or being given to the people. And as a result, it makes it very, very difficult to deal with the problem. And a lot of people that come into the country, they just basically are not in a position to come out or to be known, and as a result, we've got huge numbers of children that are born here. And I think what you'll realize is that there are four major issues that a parent is looking at. Number one, it is basically putting clothes on their children's back, food for their children on the table, and a shelter over their head, and basically education. Now, all those four, they cannot afford, to provide back in their countries because of the economic meltdown or political, situations. Now, if you ask a parent that what then becomes your choice if you've managed to get into South Africa, the parent will obviously say, look, if I go back into the country, I cannot provide any of those, and as a result, I can easily forgo education as long as at least I can see that my children are alive, they've got clothes, they can survive. So I think we are really imploring the South African government, to help here, because the biggest problem is that unless the political, conundrum that we have in Africa in regards, to governance and all these issues is resolved, then, the problem of migration is going to continue unabated.
You speak, Mr. Sibanda, again in your submissions about the idea that if this legislation were to pass, what it would mean is that it would condemn a lot of these children to life on the streets, a life of crime, and you go as far as to suggest that they be allowed to get identity documents so that they are able to study, but that could be done then with a clause that would exclude them from social security services. But what would that mean for their long-term survival? Because they would still be trapped in a cycle of poverty, which, as we've seen in studies, often leads young people to a life of crime.
Very true. I think one of the issues that we realize that, number one, right now we need a start-off point. And our start-off point is that as we continue to engage with government, we are saying from the onset, if really, they are, they put their foot down, the government put its foot down that, they want to exclude them from birth certification. Our suggestion is that at least, for starters, let them come up, with a birth certificate that shows that, maybe they are born of migrant parents and they do not have or qualify for citizenship, so that at least they can attend school. Because you see, as long as these children, are not documented in any way, they will grow up in South Africa, whether South Africa accepts it or does not necessarily accept it. And what that translates to is that this child who does not have any education at all, who does not know any other country, will not choose to go to a country that they've never been to and that they cannot try and salvage any life. So they will continue in the streets of South Africa, and as soon as they are teenagers, they will resort to crime. And the crime levels in South Africa will become so high, and the worst part of that is those people who will be committing crimes are are going to be ghost criminals, because they are nowhere in the database, of the country. So true, the long-term implication is that if temporarily the government can give them some form of paperwork to ensure that they go to school, it means that after a given period of time, still the problem needs to be resolved. But we are hoping that Africa is coming together, and I think that when we look at the spirit of Ubuntu, Africanity, and the Pan-Africanism idea, maybe it might come through for us and ensure that Africa as a whole is in a position to provide for its people rather than leave the burden particularly to South Africa.
Vusi Sibanda from the African Diaspora Forum, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.